Have you ever been scared to ask a question out loud? Maybe you fear that someone will judge you if you do. Perhaps you're nervous that you may not like the answer you get. Or maybe you would feel like less than a good Christian if you were honest about your doubts. In this series, we're tackling some of the questions we might be afraid to ask but want answers to. Does science contradict God, or is there evidence for a creator? Can I really trust a book that's 2,000 years old? If God is real, why is there so much suffering? How could a loving God send people to hell? Together, we'll explore why asking good questions is not merely okay, but essential to our faith, and we'll discover some satisfying answers along the way. This is tough stuff, and we believe God's shoulders are big enough to handle it.
Hello, Valley. It's so great to see many of you back, just sort of trickling back slowly but surely on these Saturday nights. And for those of you tuning in on our broadcast service or from the video venue or however you're joining with us this weekend, we're so grateful to have you. And especially want to give a shout out to our Valley at Home family who maybe for whatever reason you're not able or not ready to be back with us in person. We want you to know that we know you're there, we love you, and we are praying for you, and if there's anything we can do for you, please reach out. You know, I'll tell you, this Tough Stuff series has been fun so far, and we are today going to be exploring some of the most difficult aspects of living this Christian life, because we're going to be talking about this issue of suffering. As Haley said earlier, you know, one of the great questions that we ask oftentimes is, how could a loving God allow suffering and pain and evil to exist in the world? I mean, if he's Almighty God and could have the power to just sort of wipe it all away, why does he allow it to continue to exist? And then, by the way, next weekend I get to talk about the even more fun reality, the more fun question, why does a loving God send anybody to hell? So these are a couple of weeks where I'm putting a little overtime in my thought process and my preparation, obviously, for these messages, but they're so important to us because they are very, it's very important that we understand that the Bible and the God of the Bible does bring us some very satisfying and solid answers to some of the deepest questions that we wrestle with. And so again, this question of why do bad things happen to good people? You've heard it stated that way, I'm sure. And when we ask a question like that, whether we realize it or not, we're revealing a great deal about our personal core beliefs, actually, as human beings. In other words, behind those questions is a set of core assumptions that we believe to be true and by which we order our lives. The fact of the matter is that everyone believes something about the universe. Everyone believes something about life and death and happiness and God and good and evil and a host of other things. In a lot of ways, these assumptions are kind of like, if you remember back to high school geometry, they're like, it's probably like fifth grade geometry now. Kids are so much more advanced in the math, than I was in high school. But when you remember back to geometry class and you talked about axioms, they're difficult to prove, but without them, we can't solve problems. And so just like axioms, these assumptions we make are things that we hold to or we accept as though they are reality. So let's get to the heart of this question. Why does suffering exist in a universe that is governed by a good God? And what are the assumptions that lie behind a question like that? Well, in your notes, if you're following your hard copy or on your app or whatever, I've listed 5 of them for you. And for starters, when we ask these questions about why a good God allows suffering to exist, number one, we're assuming that there are indeed objective values in the universe, or in life. In other words, we're affirming that we believe that some things are in fact inherently good and other things are inherently bad or evil. Now, for many centuries, philosophers have discussed the meaning of good and evil. And while they don't always agree, there's one thing that is certain. If I were to take a survey, I know that every single one of us would much rather have the so-called good life than to suffer from the bad things that can happen to us, right? We'd rather have health than sickness, obviously. We would rather have success than failure. We would rather have good times than sorrowful times. And by asking the very question about why bad things happen, we are in fact admitting that there has to be some standard of good and evil that exists. Okay, that's number one. Then secondly, there's another assumption that lies behind these questions. And when we ask why pain and evil and suffering exist, number two, we're assuming that there's at least some kind of order to this universe. In other words, we assume that there must be an ultimate cause for the so-called good things or bad things that happen. When a tragedy occurs, we automatically look at that and we say, there's something wrong with that picture. There's a sense of fairness or justice that is violated at the core of who we are. The very protest that we make with our lips actually proves that we believe in at least some kind of order in this universe. We believe that something should make sense. Just a few years ago, and I've told this story before in actually another sermon that I preached on a similar subject a few years ago, but just a few years ago, the life of a young lady was taken right here on Interstate 80 when a eucalyptus tree fell over on her car out by Cherry Glen Road as she was just driving eastbound on Interstate 80. And I remember hearing the report to that. I talked to one of the officers actually that had been responded to the scene. And I was just thinking, this is the craziest thing I've ever heard. It doesn't make sense. I mean, car accidents, of course, happen all the times, and unfortunately even fatal ones. But nobody ever dies from a random tree falling over on their car when they're driving down a major interstate. Like, how crazy is that, right? And what I'm pointing out here is that the emotion that rises up within us at those moments is frustrating because we don't have a natural box to fit something like that into, right? We don't have a natural category for that. Nobody did anything wrong, so who can we possibly blame? Who takes responsibility for this? But either Mother Nature or a higher power. And yet at the same time, the very frustration, you guys, the very frustration that we feel in trying to make sense of something so tragic, that in and of itself is an affirmation that we do believe there must be some kind of order to the universe. Otherwise, if everything is just the product of random, undirected processes, then we really have no right to ask a question like that in the first place, right? In other words, if all this exists because of random, naturalistic, purely evolutionary processes, then we cannot really pin the blame on anybody when so-called bad things happen. Then thirdly, another assumption we're making when we ask why suffering exists is because we're assuming that people, human beings, are supremely important. Isn't that what we're saying? I mean, think about it. Very few of us, when we heard about that tragic accident on Interstate 80, very few of us were concerned about, for example, the death of that eucalyptus tree. Right? I mean, that was a living thing that lost its life. Nobody felt bad about the habitat. Well, I'm sure there are a few who specialize in this, but nobody felt bad about the habitat of insects that may have been, disturbed by the falling of that tree. Nobody ever asked whether bad things happened to tulips or guppies or cockroaches. In fact, most of us want bad things to happen to cockroaches, right? And no doubt bad things do happen to those lesser life forms. But our greater concern is for people. We assume that plants and animals are different from people. And this differentiation is important because it assigns a value to these living creatures. And then a fourth assumption we're making when we ask these questions is we're making the assumption that life really is worth living after all. Life is worth living. I mean, think about it. If life isn't fundamentally worth living, then why ask these questions in the first place? Who cares what happens to people if life isn't worth living? But of course, we innately know. We innately believe that life is indeed worth living. And that's why we wrestle with the question. And then finally, when we ask why bad things happen to good people, we're assuming, number 5, that we are capable of discovering and profiting from some answers. right? I mean, in other words, we assume that we are intelligent people with minds that are capable of interpreting data within a rational universe that is able to offer us at least some answers to our questions. We may not be able to grasp everything we'd like to grasp, but we assume that we can discover and process enough to find some encouragement and some hope to move forward and keep going. So, what does all of this mean? It means that if then you are a person like me who is prone to sincerely ask, why do bad things happen to good people? It means that these are the fundamental 5 questions of your worldview. And you have to admit that, or we all do. Otherwise, we wouldn't be asking the question in the first place. As I said, and again, what are those 5 assumptions? Here's a review: that there are values of good and evil in the cosmos. Number 2, that there is orderly design inherent in the universe. Number 3, we're assuming that human beings are of supreme and ultimate importance. Number 4, we're saying that life is fundamentally worth living. And number 5, we're saying that it's possible to discover some answers that will help us. So just understanding these things alone can be immensely helpful in moving us forward in our quest for meaning in the midst of suffering. Knowing these things, of course, in and of themselves don't necessarily solve our problems, but they do provide a catalyst for a deeper series of questions that naturally flow out of this. Questions like this: if there are values in the universe that we humans intrinsically agree upon, where do those values come from? Where do they come from? Who put them in our minds, in our hearts? What makes good good and bad bad? Who defines that? If there's cause and effect and the universe has at least some order to it, how did it get that way? If humans are unique from plants and animals in terms of their value and significance, what makes that fundamental difference? And then what is it about life itself that makes it fundamentally worth living? And of course, all these questions, you guys, they point to the overarching question that every human being is faced with. And that is the question of, what is the purpose of life? Let that sink in. Let that soak in. If you're watching online, let that soak in for a moment. What is the purpose of life? See, if I know who I am, and I know whose I am, okay, and I know that I'm here to fit in with the overall scheme that God has going in the universe, then I can better apprehend how to handle the difficult experiences of life. There's a Roman proverb that says this. I thought it was so apropos for this subject. It says, when the sailor does not know which port he is heading for, guess what? No wind is the right wind. When the sailor does not know which port he is heading for, no wind is the right wind. So the real question behind the question becomes obvious. The real question is not, why do people suffer, but rather, what is the purpose of life itself? What's the purpose of life itself? Unless we know the purpose of life itself, we cannot really determine what is truly good and what is truly bad or evil in the first place. And so I want to talk about real quick, there's this wonderful Old Testament story about a guy named Joseph. I taught a 6-part series, I think it was, on the life of Joseph a few years ago. And many of you know this famous story. He was a grandson of Abraham, and Joseph's brothers were very jealous of him. They hated him, and so they sold him into slavery. Now, during the time that Joseph was in slavery, his father Jacob the entire time thought he was dead. Okay, he thought he was dead. And so Jacob had grieved the death of his son, and eventually he basically came to accept the fact that he would never see his son again. But actually, Joseph was alive all this time as a slave in Egypt. Now, to make a long story short, Joseph, he spends a long time in prison. He suffers all kinds of injustice and mistreatment, but eventually Joseph rises to become second in charge of all of Egypt under Pharaoh. And as a result of this rise to power, he's able to rescue his father and his brothers who sold him into slavery. He's able to rescue them from a severe famine. And so as we read the story of Joseph, we're reading it, and from our limited human perspective, we get the picture that what's happening is extremely bad. Okay? We look at his story unfolding and we see, wow, jealousy and hatred, bad. We look at the story and we say, being sold into slavery, bad. Being disconnected from your family for decades, bad. Being thrown into prison on false charges, bad. I mean, it's just one bad thing after another happening in Joseph's life. But in the end, it all works out in an incredibly miraculous way. You see, Joseph's brothers, again, they come to Egypt to do what? They're looking for some crumbs, right? There's a famine in their land, and so they've heard that Egypt has had a stockpile, and so they go to Egypt looking to beg for food, and they don't realize that their brother Joseph is now in charge of the entire food distribution operation happening there in Egypt. And when they see Joseph towering over them now in his royal garb, they freak out, wouldn't you? I mean, they know what they deserve. They feel like Joseph's probably going to lash out and, off with their heads or whatever. I mean, that's what they deserve. But Joseph instead forgives them. And he provides for them. And he says to his brothers, you intended to harm me, but God intended it for good, to accomplish what is now being done, the saving of many lives. Now, I could go off on this because I get really, not only were their lives saved, but I want you to think about it. If the nation of Israel had been snuffed out because of this famine, there would be no Jesus. So when Joseph is saying what you meant for evil, God meant for good, the saving of many lives, he's not just talking about the immediate lives that were saved physically through the giving of this food. He's talking about your life. He's talking about my life, spiritually, being saved. Because the bloodline, the prophesied bloodline of the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords was able to go on. Because of everything Joseph went through. If Joseph had not been placed in that position to give mercy to his own countrymen, his own brothers and his dad, the line of Messiah would have been snuffed out. Isn't that crazy? It's amazing. And so to begin with, I think it's important that we acknowledge that we have to be humble in our approach when we're seeking to identify the experiences of life as either good or bad. Now, we can easily know when they feel good or when they feel bad. But one of the big reasons I believe we're so quick to assign value to things is because we believe somehow that happiness is the ultimate or primary goal of life, right? But is this really the case? Is it true that happiness is the goal of life, or is happiness a byproduct of a greater, larger purpose that is rooted in right thinking and right living, regardless of the challenges that we face? See, a lot of folks sincerely believe that happiness is the purpose of life, that their personal happiness is what matters most. That's why this world is so jacked up. That's why people put themselves above other people so freely and so often and so easily. And, I'm not just talking about fringe pleasure seekers who, just sort of live to eat and drink and be merry. I'm talking about most of us live under the assumption, whether we realize it or not, everyday, decent people, we live under the assumption that happiness is the goal. I mean, we just want, companionship and love. We want to earn a living and pay our bills, maybe raise a family, share in the so-called good things of life, right? What's so bad about that? Well, here's the thing. My personal belief is that life is worth living and that life should be defended because it is worth living, in spite of its many problems and difficulties, because humanity has been created to be involved in such a worthy purpose. But not everybody in this world would agree with that. There are some famous atheist philosophers I've read in the past, such as the well-known Bertrand Russell. He passed away many years ago, but he wrote a famous book called Why I Am Not a Christian. And Russell in that book refers to mankind this way. He says that mankind is a curious accident in a backwater. Okay? That was his view of life, rather uplifting. Wouldn't you agree? Then there's the famous cynic, H.L. Mencken. He refers to humanity this way. He says, mankind is a local disease of the cosmos. That's where his secularistic evolutionary thinking led him. Lovely outlook, don't you think? But if my Bible is true, and men and women really are, you and me, the image bearers of God, then you and I were created to somehow share in the purpose and the glory of God, and life is filled with new meaning. See, the 5 assumptions that I just shared with you, they seem to give at least some credence to the likelihood that God exists. That's exactly what the Bible claims, of course, that it's God who puts value into the universe and who helps you and me discern what is truly good and truly evil. It's God who made human beings and gave us our significance as the centerpiece of his creation. It's God who maintains order in the universe, even when from our limited perspective, like when we're reading through the story of Joseph and we don't know yet the end of the story, even when from our limited perspective something has gone quite wrong, God says, I'm still in charge. I'm still in charge. Simply put, it's God who makes life worth living. See, if the purpose of life is simply to fulfill evolutionary progress, then so-called bad things can't really happen to anybody. In fact, we can't even use terms like good and bad if evolution is all there is. If random, undirected, chaotic chance processes are what put us here, we can't even use terms like good or bad because whatever is supposed to happen in the evolutionary chain is good, right? Survival of the fittest. Did you realize, think about this, that in the animal kingdom, most animals actually prey upon the very creatures within their species that we moral human beings seek to protect in our species. Animals prey upon 3 categories: the weak, the elderly, and the young, right? The weak, the elderly, and the young. I mean, if you're an antelope in a herd and lions come rushing in, you're up a creek if you're weak, elderly, or young. Amen? Okay? But in that case, you only got to be the second slowest in the herd to get out of there. But because if you're weak, elderly, or young, you're going to get caught. It's survival of the fittest. And yet humans, we have a moral dimension that the animal kingdom does not have. And this ethical or moral dimension that I believe is derived from our Creator is what innately tells us that we should actually protect the weak, protect the elderly, protect the young. So if Darwinian evolutionary theory is true and there is no intelligent God giving order to the universe, then the tragedies of life are only helping to lift us higher on the evolutionary ladder, because the weak are just going to be purged out. What the heck? It's good news, right? Obviously, I seriously doubt that any of us have found any comfort or strength in the midst of suffering from believing in a worldview like that. I mean, evolutionary ideas might make, they might make for a fine laboratory experiment, but they lose their vitality in the context of an ICU. Or in the context of sitting next to an open grave as a family grieves. And what's more is that while Darwinian evolutionary theory may have a grid for how to explain things like birth defects or other physical problems, it can never adequately address the existence of moral evil. Moral evil in this world. It's one thing, for example, to explain this to you. It's one thing if your child is born with a physical malady. It's quite another if they're kidnapped and murdered. Do you see the difference? I mean, those are both difficult, but they're 2 different levels of bad. Are you with me? 2 different levels. Those wicked deeds done by that murderer, that kidnapper, are those really part of just the so-called evolutionary process? Is a person who would carry out such deeds really, truly, objectively culpable in any ethical or moral sense, or are they only an agent of the evolutionary process? And then if that's the truth, how can we really hold them accountable if it's true? I'm not saying that, bringing God into the discussion automatically solves all the problems that we might want answers to. What I am saying is that to leave God out of the equation is to make the discussion fundamentally pointless in the first place. See, we have no essential right to ask why bad things happen if God does not exist. Because if life is merely a matter of random, undirected processes, then there is no objective standard for good and evil in the first place. In the realm of spirituality and theology, philosophers and theologians have argued for centuries about the question of what's called first cause. In other words, is God ultimately responsible for evil? Does God actually cause evil, or does God somehow allow evil to exist for a higher purpose? And there are some extreme, what I would call theistic determinists, or you might call them fatalists, right? People who believe that the sovereignty of God totally disallows for any real freedom of choice among God's creatures. And these folks would actually claim that God is the cause of both good and evil, and that we just have to accept that, even though it might not sit well with us. And without getting deeply into the arguments on either side, Jesus Christ makes a statement that is very helpful in understanding the way things really are. If you'll turn quickly with me to John chapter 10, the Gospel of John chapter 10, we find a place where Jesus is talking about the reason that he came. And he's already established the fact that he has come as God in human flesh to show the heart of the Father to the world. And Jesus says in John 10:10 these words, very powerful words. He says, "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy." That's the work of the thief, to steal and kill and destroy. He says, "I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." Let me read that one more time. "The thief comes only to steal and kill and destroy. I have come that they may have life and have it to the full." So Jesus introduces a contrast here between the character of the thief, okay, a reference to Satan, and the character of God revealed in himself. And according to Jesus, while God is indeed sovereign ultimately over all things, God is the giver of abundant life, and it's actually Satan who steals and kills and destroys. Now, some of you know that I love theology. I better love it if I'm a pastor. I love reading it. I love writing. I love conversing with God and about God with other people. And one of the things you'll hear some people claim is that in order for God to truly be sovereign, in order for him to truly be in control, then he logically must be the cause of everything that happens, the actual cause. In other words, if freedom of choice exists on any real level, then these folks will say that God somehow compromises his sovereignty. In my opinion, that's ludicrous. In my opinion, and in the opinion of many others, I think it's the exact opposite. I think that God's ability to bring ultimate direction to the universe while still allowing angels and humans to make very real choices of the will, I think this actually adds to the glory of God's sovereignty. I mean, if God were a cosmic puppeteer who was just sitting behind a curtain, pulling the strings and causing everything that happens to happen, then nobody can really be held accountable for their actions in that scenario either, any more than you can in the evolution scenario, right? And I think the fact that God is both in charge and allowing for real volitional choices to be made, I think this actually magnifies, not diminishes, his sovereignty. In fact, the idea that God can on a daily basis, that he can allow 7.5 billion free moral agents to make individual choices of the will, and he can still guide the world toward his appointed future of it, that's a testament far greater to the sovereignty of God, in my opinion, than if he forced every single thing to happen in the universe. So God is not the culprit. God is not the culprit. The Bible reveals that God created everything and said it was good. Over and over and over. You read the first chapter of Genesis over and over. He creates the sun and moon and the stars. It's good. He separates the land from the sea. It's good. He creates the things that roam upon the ground and the fish of the sea. It's good. It's good. It's good. It's good. And it was only when humanity chose to rebel against God, inviting sin into the world, that evil and suffering began to snowball. When the serpent tempted our earliest ancestors, he said that if they chose to ignore God and go his way instead of God's way, he said that he made a false promise to them. It was actually had some truth to it. He said that they would become like God, knowing good and evil. And in that sense, he was right. And why is this a big deal? Because when there was no evil in the world and they simply walked with God in their naive innocence, there was no suffering to be found. Up to that point, they were a bit naive about this fallen angel named Lucifer who had rebelled against God and had taken a third of all the holy angels with him in this rebellion. And God, in judgment, cast him to the earth. And God knew good versus evil, but he never wanted his human creation to have to bear that burden. But according to Scripture, Adam chose poorly when Lucifer tempted him in the form of a serpent, and the rest of humanity has suffered the consequences of a decaying world ever since. Next weekend, as I said, we're going to be diving into the final question in our series, how can a loving God send anyone to hell? And we're going to wrestle deeply with that next weekend. But today, it's important for us to understand that Jesus said that hell was not originally intended for mankind in the first place. That hell was created for the devil and his fallen angels as a place of judgment for them, in response to the legacy of suffering and pain and evil that they had brought into God's creation. And this is where the good news of the gospel comes in. You see, the Bible is not a book about a God who enjoys sending anybody to hell. It's a book about a God who enjoys saving people from it. We human beings, we chose to align ourselves with God's judgment when we chose sin over God. And some people would say, well, that's not fair that we get punished because of Adam's sin. But I really want to say this. I think that if there's an ounce of humility in each of us, we would have to agree that we would have been just as guilty as Adam had we been in his shoes there in the Garden of Eden. We've all done things we're not proud of. We've all made decisions that caused other people besides ourselves to suffer because of our decisions, whether it brought great suffering or a little suffering. We all know what that feels like. And the good news I want to share with you today is from Romans chapter 5. We're going to land the plane here. It's in verse 12. We're going to pick up where we read this. Therefore, just as sin entered the world through one man, and death through sin, and in this way death came to all people because all sinned. Okay, so in other words, because of the first Adam, sin brought death and all of its misery associated with it, brought it into this world. And the passage continues in let's skip to verse 15. But the gift is not like the trespass, the sin. For if the many died by the trespass of one man, Adam, how much more did God's grace and the gift that came by the grace of the one man, Jesus Christ, overflow to the many? So the sin of the first Adam was passed on to us, but God didn't stop there. Aren't you glad he didn't stop there? God wouldn't leave us in our self-inflicted cesspool of sin. The first Adam gave us the cancer of sin, but there was a last Adam, Jesus Christ, who brought the cure as a free gift of his grace. Passage continues. Consequently, just as one trespass resulted in condemnation for all people, so also one righteous act resulted in justification and life for all people. For just as through the disobedience of the one man, Adam, the many were made sinners, you and me, so also through the obedience of the one man, Jesus, the many will be made righteous, you and me. So yes, we inherited the fallenness of the first Adam, which is the reason that evil and suffering exist, but we also inherit the favor, the matchless grace of Jesus, the last Adam, which is totally undeserved and is, in fact, the gospel, the good news. The gospel reverses the curse of sin. Yes, we're still affected by the fallenness of this temporary world that we inhabit, but we are rescued from the eternal effects of sin through faith in Jesus Christ. The first Adam brought us condemnation. The last Adam brought us salvation. The first Adam brought us death. The last Adam brought us deliverance. The first Adam brought us judgment. The last Adam brings us justification. God declaring us righteous. God, because of the finished work of his Son on the cross, declaring that we are now good enough for him. That's what righteousness means in layman's terms. Goodness that is good enough for God. Which means that no matter what happens to you, no matter what someone else does to you, no matter what you've done to someone else, Christ offers a gift called righteousness, a gift of goodness that is good enough for God. It's an amazing gift. It's an amazing gift. As we close for today, I'm going to pray for you in just a moment. But as we close and the band comes up to lead us in a closing song, I just do want to mention a really cool opportunity. Christian recording artist Jason Gray is coming. He's been actually here at Valley, did a show quite a few years ago. Great artist, and he's going to be at the Journey downtown location on May 8th, Saturday night. And so, normally I would say don't miss church on a Saturday night for you Saturday night churchgoers. But if you go to this concert, I won't be upset as long as you come to church on Sunday, okay? But seriously, Jason Gray is amazing. It's going to be an intimate, tight-knit concert in that great little venue. And so I wanted to mention that because Jason has gone through a lot of suffering in his life. Some of it self-inflicted, other things through no fault of his own. Abuse, abandonment, a stutter that he's had to, speech impediment that he's had to work through to the point that he's become a gospel recording artist. Pretty amazing. But I really think his life and his testimony, his music bring this home. So if you've never heard Jason Gray, go to, I think it's journeycoffeeco.com and grab some tickets, and I'll just sit back here and preach that night and be jealous that you're there and I'm not, okay? But I'm telling you, it's going to be a great concert. And with that, I want to pray, and I want to ask anybody tuning in online, anybody here live with us in the house, if you have not received this gift from God, this gift of righteousness, I know that's a big religious sounding word, but again, it just means it's goodness that's good enough for God. See, we were all born unrighteous. We were all born, it comes from a medical term from the ancient Greek culture, and it referred to a doctor resetting a broken bone that was crooked and then it's been set straight. We were all born crooked is what I'm trying to say. And God has set us straight through the sacrifice of his son. We were like a square peg in a round hole. We didn't fit together with God because he was perfect and we weren't. So we needed that gift of goodness. We needed that gift of righteousness, and Jesus gives us that. He rescues us from the pit of our despair. And whatever you're going through, and I know there's some people that are going through some significant pain. You've lost loved ones recently. You're in the midst of battling some sort of medical condition or some sort of mental health challenge. I'm just looking around the room and not pointing anybody out, but I know you're here, and I've heard bits and pieces of your story. And then I know there are others who I don't even know what's going on, but I know you're hurting. Listen, I want to reach out to the healer on your behalf right now and ask for him to begin to move like you've never sensed him move in your life before. As the band starts to play, let's just cry out to God as our healer. Father, we thank you that by your stripes we are healed. We thank you that you were like a sheep led to the slaughter, that you didn't resist, you didn't push back or fight against it. You let it all play out because you knew that the end result of what seemed like the worst day in human history, the day that seemed like Satan had won the battle, the day that seemed like evil men and women had accomplished their task. We know that horrible day was resolved 3 days later. And we thank you that resurrection power is available for our healing today. And so for those that are just crying out to you, those that are hurting, those that have drenched their pillowcase in tears in recent days, weeks, months, meet them in the midst of that pain. May they lean on you like never before. And for anyone who doubts whether there is a good God that is with us, even in the midst of the bad things that happen to us, pour out your presence and your mercy in such a way they never doubt it again. In Jesus' name, amen. We stand and let's worship our King together today.